The whip cracked, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the heavy air of the quarry. Dust kicked up from the parched earth, choking the men as they strained against the weight of the limestone. Moses hauled at the ropes, his muscles corded and trembling, his feet sliding on the loose grit. The sun was a physical pressure, a white-hot weight that turned the sand into a furnace. A guard paced the perimeter, his rhythm steady, his eyes scanning for the slightest hesitation. One man collapsed, his knees hitting the rock with a sickening thud. The guard did not wait. He stepped forward, the lash whistling through the air to strike the man across the back. There was no room for fatigue, no time for breath. The line surged forward again, a slow, grinding movement of thousands of men, trapped in a cycle of endless labor. Pharaoh watched from the high terrace, his gaze fixed on the dust clouds rising from the pits. Below, the shouting of overseers drowned out the murmurs of the workers. Every block placed was another day of survival. But the stone only grew heavier, and the sun beat down with a cruelty that felt like a permanent law of the world. In that hush beneath the palms, Egypt's cruel burdens faded as Miriam, Moses' sister, remembered the child drawn from the river into destiny. Pulled from among the reeds of the Nile, a servant placed the baby in the basket on the riverbank, where one fragile cry would echo through history. From the river's fragile hush, a forgotten child was lifted into royal hands, and a nation's deliverer, ordained by God, entered Pharaoh's house. Years passed within the high, cool walls of the palace. Moses walked the polished stone corridors, his path taking him past the outer work zones where the air hung thick with dust. A guard stood over a man, the heavy leather strap rising and falling with mechanical precision. The sound of the impact echoed against the masonry. Moses reached the pair in 3 long strides. He shoved the guard with both hands, a sudden release of pent-up tension. The man stumbled backward, his heel catching on an uneven slab, and he struck his temple against the sharp edge of a limestone block. He went limp, eyes staring blankly at the sky. A sudden, ringing silence descended on the courtyard. Moses knelt, pressing his fingers to the guard's neck. There was no pulse. The reality of the act settled into his lungs, heavy and cold. He glanced left, then right, the palace gates looming like a cage. He did not return to his chambers. He turned his back on the marble columns and the high, gilded ceilings, moving toward the city outskirts. His stride quickened as he passed the last of the watchtowers, leaving the palace and his former life behind, and disappeared into the rising heat of the desert. The jagged peaks of Midian offered no comfort. Moses moved through the mountain passes, his wooden staff striking the ground with a rhythmic, hollow thud. His breath hitched in the thin, cold air. Keeping the flock together required constant movement. He climbed over loose shale and navigated narrow ledges where the sheep threatened to wander into the ravines. Every muscle in his legs burned from the relentless incline. He spent hours guiding the animals toward patches of scrub grass, his movements measured and slow. As the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon, he gathered the stragglers and led them to a sheltered hollow. He knelt by a small, crackling campfire, the heat barely touching the night chill. He looked down at his palms. The skin was thick, mapped with deep, dark calluses and ingrained with mountain grit. He rubbed his hands together, the friction sounding like dry leaves. He stared into the embers, the memory of the palace fading into the vast, silent dark of the wilderness. He was no longer a man of status, but a man of the earth, defined by the weight of the staff and the solitude of the climb. The fire in the hearth was dying when a sudden light flared to the left. Moses turned. A desert scrub bush was engulfed in flames, yet the leaves remained vibrant green. He stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took a step forward, then another, watching the branches. The fire did not consume the wood. It merely danced upon the surface. He reached the base of the bush and knelt, feeling the heat radiate against his face. He slid his sandals from his feet, the dry earth cool against his skin. A voice emerged from the center of the light, resonant and steady, vibrating through the ground beneath him. It spoke of the suffering in Egypt and a command to return. Moses covered his face with his hands, his knuckles trembling as the weight of the message settled into his bones. The vast solitude of the mountains vanished, replaced by an urgent, terrifying clarity. He stood up, his grip tightening on his wooden staff. The fire began to dim, but the directive remained etched in his mind. He turned away from the embers, facing the direction of the distant Nile, and began the long walk back to the life he had discarded. The palace gates loomed like a wall of solid stone carved with symbols of ancient power. Moses stood before them, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. The air here felt thick, heavy with the scent of incense and stagnant heat. Guards stood motionless at the threshold, their spears crossed in a sharp, metallic barrier. Moses did not stop. He stepped forward, his knuckles white, as he tightened his hold on the wood. The guards shifted, eyes narrowing, but Moses pushed through the gap between them, his presence cutting through the silence. They reached the heavy, gilded doors. With a grunt of exertion, they leaned their weight against the wood. The hinges groaned, a long, screeching protest that echoed through the courtyard. As the doors swung open, the cool, stale air of the throne room rushed out to meet them. They stepped into the dim interior, the light from the entrance casting long, jagged shadows across the polished floor. At the far end, the throne stood elevated, and there Pharaoh waited. Moses stopped, planted his feet, and leveled his gaze. He spoke, his voice steady, ringing against the cold stone walls. "Thus says God, let my people go." Pharaoh did not blink. He leaned forward, a sharp, dismissive laugh echoing off the ceiling before he signaled his guards. He issued a new decree. The Israelites would no longer receive straw for their bricks, yet their daily quota would remain unchanged. The message traveled fast. By dawn, the fields were silent, the supply wagons empty. Guards paced the rows of the labor camps, their whips lashing the air to emphasize the new reality. Men scrambled to gather stubble from the fields, their fingers torn and bleeding as they clawed at the dry, unyielding earth. The limestone blocks felt heavier, the sun more merciless. Moses watched from the perimeter as the workers stumbled under the strain. There was no rhythm to the work now, only the frantic, desperate scramble to meet an impossible deadline. Faces that had held a flicker of hope just yesterday were now etched with exhaustion and a growing, bitter resentment. The guards stood over them, watching for the slightest sign of hesitation, their presence a constant, suffocating weight. The air in the valley turned sour with the smell of wet mud and sweat, as the labor became a slow, grinding torture that threatened to break the spirit of the people entirely. Instructed by God, Moses reached the riverbank and raised his staff high. He brought it down against the surface of the Nile with a heavy, hollow thud. The water did not ripple. It shuddered, starting from the point of impact. A deep, thick crimson bled outward, turning the current into a stagnant, iron-scented sludge. Fish rose to the surface, their scales dull, bobbing lifelessly against the reeds. The people on the banks scrambled back, screaming as the water touched the land. Then came the sound, a rhythmic, wet croaking that swelled from the riverbeds. Thousands of frogs vaulted from the mud, covering the paths, invading the courtyards, and piling into the kitchens of the city. Before the panic could settle, the air itself seemed to thicken. A dark, buzzing cloud descended, turning the daylight into a gray, suffocating haze. Gnats filled every breath, clinging to skin and eyes. The palace floors were no longer stone, but a shifting carpet of life. Servants dropped their trays as the flies swarmed the banquet tables, burying the food in a black, vibrating mass. Pharaoh watched from his balcony, his hand gripping the stone railing, as the river of life became a source of rot, and the land of power became a chamber of infestation. Pharaoh sat motionless on his throne, his jaw locked, refusing to acknowledge the devastation surrounding him. Outside, the rhythm of destruction shifted. In the fields, the cattle did not fall to sickness, but dropped instantly, their bodies hitting the dry earth with a heavy, final thud. A silence followed, short and brittle, before the sky itself fractured. A roar echoed from above, descending with the velocity of a falling mountain. Balls and blocks of ice, burning with a strange, unearthly fire, slammed into the earth. The air filled with the sharp, jagged sound of stone splintering. One impact struck the palace roof, the sound of tearing masonry drowning out the shouts of the guards. Dust and light poured through the jagged hole, illuminating the throne room in a harsh, chaotic glare. Pharaoh flinched as debris skittered across the floor, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the structure groaned and buckled. Across the horizon, the sky remained a bruised, violent color, flickering with the glow of descending fire. The earth trembled under the relentless barrage, and for the first time the king reached out to steady himself against the stone of his own throne, the weight of the judgment finally pressing down. A low hum began at the horizon, growing into a roar that rattled the teeth. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with a living, rustling shroud. Millions of locusts descended, a wave of wings and clicking mandibles. They hit the fields like a scythe, stripping stalks to the root in seconds. Every blade of green disappeared, leaving the earth barren and brown. The hungry swarm pressed against the palace walls, a million tiny impacts against the stone. Then, the sound stopped. The insects lifted in a single, unified motion, vanishing as quickly as they had arrived. But the sun did not return. A heavy, thick, and unnatural gloom rolled across the land, swallowing the cities and the desert alike. It was a darkness that defied flame and torchlight, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes. Inside the palace, the guards stood frozen, unable to see their own outstretched hands. In the streets, the movement of the people ceased entirely. The world held its breath in the void. For 3 days, no one stood, no one spoke, and no one walked. The land was not merely dim, it was erased, trapped in a suffocating, silent tomb where time itself seemed to stop. The darkness retreated as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a cold, biting air. Inside the Hebrew quarters, there was no sound of panic, only the rhythmic scrape of brushes against wood. God instructed Moses to tell all Israelite families to dip hyssop into basins of lamb's blood and mark their doorposts and lintels with its crimson sign. They worked in precise, urgent silence. Once the thresholds were sealed, they gathered inside, eating, standing up, their eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors. The city of Egypt lay quiet, unaware of the approaching shift. Then, midnight arrived. The stillness snapped. A single, sharp wail pierced the night, followed instantly by a chorus of agony that rose from every house, every palace, and every alleyway. It was a sound of absolute loss, a collective scream that rattled the window frames. The air grew heavy with the weight of the final judgment. The 10th plague was the death of every firstborn in Egypt. In the streets, lanterns flickered and fell as people collapsed in the sudden, crushing reality of their grief. The lamb's blood saved all Israeli families from death and within the marked homes, but the rest of the Egyptian city had been visited by the angel of death in a single, shivering heartbeat. The sun rose over a city silenced by grief. Pharaoh sat on his throne, his face gaunt, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him. He did not look at his counselors. He did not look at his generals. He simply raised one trembling hand and gestured toward the gates. It was a command of total surrender. Outside the palace, the long-held tension of the labor camps snapped. The gates swung wide, and the first wave of people surged forward. There was no hesitation now. They moved in a dense, rhythmic tide, the sound of thousands of feet hitting the stone echoing through the streets. Egyptians stood on their doorsteps, pressing heavy bowls of gold and silver into the hands of the departing workers, desperate only for them to leave. The Israelites did not look back. They loaded their carts, their backs straight, their pace quickening with every step away from the city walls. The heavy dust of the road kicked up, obscuring the path ahead, but they followed the horizon. The yoke was broken. The long march toward the desert had begun, and for the first time in generations, the rhythm of their movement was dictated by their own will, not by the lash. The horizon stretched flat and wide, meeting the blue expanse of the Red Sea. The Israelites slowed their pace, the sand soft and yielding beneath their feet. A cool breeze rolled off the water, offering a brief moment of relief from the long trek. Then the rhythm changed. A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the ground, vibrating up through their heels. It was not the wind. It was not the sea. It was the synchronized thunder of thousands of hooves and iron-rimmed wheels. Moses stopped, his head snapping toward the rear. Behind them, a dust cloud billowed against the sky, growing taller and darker with every passing second. The sound surged, a relentless, grinding roar that drowned out the waves. Pharaoh's army crested the distant ridge, a wall of glinting bronze and steel. The march dissolved into chaos. People stopped, turned, and saw the trap closing. Cries of terror erupted, echoing off the water. They were pushed to the very edge, heels digging into the wet shore, the sea churning before them, and the relentless, mechanical death closing in from behind. Moses stepped toward the churning foam. He ignored the screams behind him and planted his feet in the shallows. He raised his staff high, his grip iron-tight, and brought it down against the surface. The impact sent a shockwave through the water. A violent wind roared to life, tearing at the air, and the sea began to rip apart. Water spiraled upward, climbing into two massive, glistening walls that towered over the shore. The seabed lay exposed, a path of damp sand and stone. Moses signaled forward. The Israelites surged into the gap, moving with frantic, desperate speed between the towering liquid cliffs. Behind them, the rumble of the chariots returned. The Egyptian army surged onto the dry path, hooves striking the mud, blades raised. They did not stop. They did not look up at the walls of water. They pushed into the center of the passage, greed driving them forward. Moses reached the far bank and gestured once more. The wind died instantly. The massive walls collapsed. A wall of blue, heavy and unstoppable, slammed down upon the path. The sound of the ocean reclaiming its space drowned out the final cries of the pursuers. Then, the surface flattened into a calm, unbroken mirror. The silence on the far shore was absolute. The ocean had ceased its roar, leaving only the sound of rhythmic waves lapping against the sand. Survivors stood frozen, staring back at the horizon where the path had once been. Then, a sharp, metallic jingle cut through the quiet. Miriam, worshiping and thanking God for breaking them free from bondage of more than 400 years in Egypt. Miriam gripped a tambourine, her wrist snapping, sending a rhythmic pulse echoing across the dunes. She took a step, then another, her feet marking a beat in the damp earth. The people turned. Their eyes shifted from the water to the woman in their midst. One by one, they began to move. The collective weight of decades of labor began to lift as the first light of dawn crested the jagged peaks of the mountains. The sky turned from bruised purple to a brilliant searing gold. The singing started low, a hum that grew into a resonant rhythmic chant. Men and women joined the circle, their movements unburdened, their steps finding a new, synchronized cadence saying thank you to God, Almighty Father. They were no longer running. They were walking. They moved as a single body, leaving the shore behind, heading toward the vast, open desert, the sun illuminating the path ahead that God planned for His children. If you enjoyed this movie as much as we did, please subscribe and share and leave any comment. God bless you.